Hi. Hi, everyone. Today, welcome to the first and inaugural session of our seminar series at the department. Today we have Michael Rome. Michael is a postdoctoral. Michael is in a postdoctoral position, has a postdoctoral position at Kaplan Center at UCT. He finished his PhD at Yale, working on Jewish, Latin American and Jewish history, and is currently working on his monograph, which is on the same topic. His research examines ethnic political activism and national, communal, generational belonging during global Cold War. Welcome, Michael. And just to give you just some housekeeping, we usually have about 30-35 minutes for you to present, and then we will open it up to for discussion for about 15-20 minutes. I think we have time till 7, if I'm correct. So, Michael, take it away.
Great, thank you, Nandarup, for that lovely introduction. It's nice to meet everybody, and I wish we had met under different circumstances. Excuse me. The paper that I'm about to share is a work in progress, so I appreciate in advance any feedback that you may have. In the interest of time, I've skipped the first section, which gives an overview of the establishment of the Brazilian military regime and some background into the students that I profiled, but I'd be happy to go into more detail about this section in the Q&A. On a Saturday evening in August 1971, a university student named Ney Reutemann was driving his father's Volkswagen Beetle in the Rio de Janeiro neighborhood of Ipanema when he encountered a police roadblock. With him in the car was a teenage couple named Alberto Sprecher and Teresa Cristina Peixoto, members of the October 8th Revolutionary Movement, MR8, an underground Marxist organization engaged in armed struggle against the Brazilian military dictatorship. They were transporting a clandestine MR8 activist named Cesar Benjamin, who had recently returned to Rio de Janeiro from the northeastern city of Salvador. It was a routine police roadblock, but Reutemann had left the car's registration at home, causing police to search the vehicle. Benjamin took advantage of the momentary confusion to escape, but he left behind a backpack containing a diary, maps of Salvador, and a .38 caliber revolver. When a policeman discovered the backpack's contents, he promptly arrested the car's remaining 3 occupants. Brought to the headquarters of the Department of Political and Social Order, known as DOPS, the police agency responsible for investigating political crimes, Reutemann, Sprecher, and Peixoto attempted to convince their police interrogators that Benjamin was a mere hitchhiker, who they had picked up after recognizing him from their days in the student movement. The story held up for less than 20 minutes. When an interrogator showed Sprecher a page from the diary and asked him if he knew who it belonged to, Sprecher realized that he was in trouble. He recognized the writing as belonging to Carlos Lamarca, a former army captain who had recently joined the MR8 after a stint in the leadership of another armed struggle organization, the Revolutionary Popular Vanguard, VPR. Lamarca, then living clandestinely in the interior of the state of Bahia, was the most wanted man in Brazil. Subjected to harsh torture, Sprecher's ability to convince his interrogators that he didn't know Lamarca's whereabouts became a matter of life and death. To do so, he attempted to convey his relative unimportance within the MR8 organizational hierarchy by describing his duties as a member of the organization's support network. These included staking out supermarkets that the organization planned to rob, to raise money to sustain its underground activists, and transporting clandestine activists like Benjamin. To substantiate his story, he had to reveal the names of other members of the MR8 support network, such as Ari Reutemann, Ney's cousin and the network's coordinator, Jaime Ben Shimol and Liana Koiler, a young couple who had also conducted supermarket stakeouts, and Luis Carlos Rotberg, who had hosted Benjamin the previous 2 nights. Like Sprecher, all 4 activists were Jewish. Their subsequent arrests led to a curious phenomenon, a police-military inquest in which 6 out of 7 defendants and all 4 witnesses were Brazilian Jews. These activists shared more than just a common ethnic origin. Born in the decade following the end of World War II, they came of age during the 1960s, a global era of youth countercultures and political contestations. From Berkeley to Berlin, Paris to Prague, and Tokyo to Toronto, students and other young activists protested against racial discrimination, unjust wars, authoritarian regimes, and the politics of their parents' generation. In Latin America, as in North America and Europe, university students participated in anti-government demonstrations, attended rock festivals, experimented with psychedelic drugs, and challenged prevailing sexual mores. Inspired by the Cuban Revolution and Ernesto Che Guevara, their more radical peers joined Marxist guerrilla organizations that advocated the armed overthrow of established governments and attempted to bring about a continent-wide revolution. The 1960s were a particularly dramatic period in Brazilian history. The presidency of João Goulart, which began in 1961, marked an era of political effervescence led by students, workers, and peasant groups, brought to a premature end by the military coup of March 1964. Once in power, the Brazilian military arrested over 50,000 activists from communist parties, leftist Catholic organizations, and labor unions. With these activists in jail and exile, high school and university students became important voices of opposition to military rule, most notably in student-led street demonstrations that brought over 100,000 protesters to the streets of Rio de Janeiro in June 1968. In response to increasing pressure from students and other sectors of civil society, the military regime issued Institutional Act No. 5 in December 1968, ushering in a series of repressive measures that effectively quashed the student movement. When nonviolent opposition to military rule became increasingly unviable, students turned instead to clandestine armed struggle organizations. This article examines the participation of Brazilian Jewish students in the armed struggle against the military dictatorship, focusing on the experiences of 12 Jewish activists and drawing on secret police records, memoirs, and oral history interviews. It situates these experiences within their class, generational, and geographic contexts. Like their non-Jewish comrades, Brazilian Jewish anti-dictatorship activists were predominantly middle class, in their late teens or early 20s, and living in the southeastern cities of Rio and São Paulo. Unlike most non-Jewish activists, however, they were mainly the children of immigrants who had arrived in Brazil during the interwar and post-war years, and the beneficiaries of both post-war Jewish socioeconomic upward mobility and the creation of a network of leftist Jewish schools and summer camps that provided them with strong social ties. Through the lens of Jewish student activists, this article offers a new perspective on the Brazilian armed struggle, paying particular attention to previously overlooked everyday revolutionaries such as high school students and members of support networks. Furthermore, as the first extended examination of the participation of Jewish activists in Latin American guerrilla movements, this article presents an original approach to the study of ethnicity in the Latin American Cold War. In his study of Japanese-Brazilian armed struggle activists, Jeffrey Lesser showed that these activists often viewed their political involvement as a means of asserting their belonging in the Brazilian national community. While this was certainly true of Brazilian Jewish activists as well, this article highlights an aspect heretofore overlooked in scholarship on ethnic militancy during the Latin American 60s, that of generational belonging. Informed by the effective turn in historical scholarship, this article considers the experiences, emotions, and inner conflicts of Jewish student activists in order to explore different facets of generational belonging during the long 1960s in academic institutions, political organizations, and broader revolutionary movements. As this article argues, these different facets of generational belonging were both complementary and competing. For many Jewish students, academic, organizational, and revolutionary belonging initially dovetailed, but they subsequently diverged. As students' political engagements deepened, state violence worsened, and revolutionary organizations sundered under the weight of ideological rifts, forcing these students to make difficult choices between different forms of belonging. By reconstructing these choices, this article elucidates the complex relationship between ethnic militancy and generational belonging in Cold War Latin America. Next slide, please, Anandarup. Thank you. In 1967, a French philosophy student named Régis Dubray published a book entitled Revolution in the Revolution. Drawing on the example of the Cuban Revolution, Dubray's book promoted the idea of the Foucault theory, which claimed that a small revolutionary vanguard could use armed insurrection to lead a successful guerrilla war against the dictatorship. Published nearly simultaneously in several other languages, including Portuguese, it found a ready audience among Brazilian students. Convinced of the particular relevance of the Foucault theory for Latin America, students and other activists in the Brazilian Communist Party criticized their organization's reluctance to embrace armed struggle as a means of overthrowing the military regime. One of these critics was Carlos Marighella, who you can see on the right, a veteran communist activist and former federal deputy, who the party expelled in September 1967 after he traveled to Cuba against its wishes. Marighella established his own organization, the Communist Group of São Paulo, which in February 1968 began calling for guerrilla war against the dictatorship. Even as Dubray's ideas rapidly gained Brazilian adherents, the living embodiment of the Foucault theory fell in battle. In October 1967, the Bolivian army captured and executed Che Guevara after his failed attempt to launch a guerrilla Foucault in Bolivia. Next slide, please, Anandrup. Upon hearing the news, Brazilian students organized protest demonstrations, including one which a Jewish university student named Anna Borstein, who you can see on the left, attended. Guevara's abiding influence could also be seen in protests that were ostensibly about more mundane issues. A few days after the assassination, a Jewish high school student named Alfredo Serkis took part in his first demonstration in front of the Ministry of Education building in downtown Rio. A conscientious liberal, Serkis agreed with the objectives of the protest organized by the Metropolitan Student Union, protesting the unsanitary conditions at the Calabouço low-income student restaurant, the agreement between the Ministry of Education and the U.S. Agency for International Development, and annual university tuition fees. But he decided to remain silent when the crowd shouted Guevara's name. I thought that shouting Guevara was a communist thing, and I wasn't a communist, Serkis wrote in his memoir. By January 1968, however, he had reconsidered his Cold War allegiances, exchanging the poster of John F. Kennedy that hung in his bedroom for one of the martyred Argentine. Next slide, please. Student protests continued throughout 1968. In March, a few weeks after the beginning of the academic year, military police shot and killed an 18-year-old high school student named Edson Luiz de Lima Soto during a protest in front of the Calabouço restaurant. The death of Edson Luiz sparked further protests, turning the student movement into a mass movement. In 1968, at the peak of the mass actions led by the student movement, the mobilizations and marches brought school to a standstill, remembered Alberto Sprecher. May and June were a cycle of repeated demonstrations. The largest of these demonstrations, which you can see here on June 26th, brought 100,000 protesters to downtown Rio de Janeiro. Students in São Paulo also took part in demonstrations, and beginning in June, students in the University of São Paulo Philosophy Department occupied the department building, turning it into the headquarters of the São Paulo student movement. As the nonviolent student movement reached its peak in mid-1968, clandestine organizations advocating armed struggle began to proliferate. The most active of these organizations was the National Liberating Action, ALN, the new name of Carlos Marighella's organization, which in 1968 began robbing banks as a means of funding its activities. Dissidents from another communist organization, the Revolutionary Marxist Organization, known as POLOPI, formed their own splinter groups to promote the armed struggle. Activists in Rio and Belo Horizonte created an organization called Commandos of National Liberation, Colina, in October 1968, while rebels in São Paulo joined up with purged leftist army officers to create the Revolutionary Popular Vanguard, VPR, in December of that year. The VPR attracted some members of the student dissidents of the Communist Party in São Paulo, while other student dissidents joined the ALN. Eager to assert their own revolutionary belonging, high school students in Rio de Janeiro created their own organization. In August 1968, Alfredo Serkis and Luiz Carlos Rothberg founded a committee with 5 other students, which they called the Comissão Secundarista, High School Student Committee, known as COSEC for short. They used this committee to coordinate the high school student movement throughout the Southern Zone and to recruit high school students for the armed struggle. COSEC had its own weapons arsenal, which it stored in the vacant apartment of Rothberg's grandfather, who had immigrated to Israel. On weekends, COSEC activists practiced shooting pistols and shotguns and learned to fashion Molotov cocktails at their families' vacation homes in the interior of the state. Yet even as they benefited from their parents' middle-class privilege, they also conducted ideological discussions involving Maoist-inspired sessions of criticism and self-criticism, where students sought to, quote, imbue ourselves with the revolutionary ideology of the proletariat, as Sirkis recalled. During one session, Sirkis disavowed his class origins and affirmed his revolutionary belonging by renouncing a year-end trip to France, which his mother had already paid for. I had a feeling of total commitment to the revolution, he wrote. At the March of 100,000 in Rio in June 1968, advocates of nonviolent resistance and armed struggle faced off, with the former chanting, "Only an organized people can overthrow the dictatorship," and the latter responding, "Only an armed people can overthrow the dictatorship." When police used machine guns to fire at nonviolent protesters in late October, however, it appeared that nonviolent resistance was no longer possible. This impression only increased following the implementation of Institutional Act No. 5 in December 1968. Inaugurating a state of exception, this act gave the dictatorship absolute power, allowing the president to close Congress and rule by executive decree, instituting press and artistic censorship, and suspending habeas corpus for political crimes. This last measure enabled the indefinite detention of suspects without an arrest warrant, the use of torture as a method of interrogation, and the disappearance of political prisoners, ushering in the most repressive period of the military dictatorship, subsequently known as the Years of Lead. Institutional Act No. 5 effectively quashed the student movement and other nonviolent forms of opposition to the dictatorship, prompting advocates of armed struggle to argue that they offered one of the few viable avenues of resistance to military rule. Next slide, please. Thank you. The clandestine guerrilla organizations took advantage of the hardening of the dictatorship to recruit new members. In December 1968, an army captain named Carlos Lamarca, who you can see on the left, secretly joined the VPR, and the next month he deserted from his army barracks in the São Paulo suburb of Osasco, along with 3 other soldiers, 63 rifles, 3 machine guns, and ammunition. Emboldened by these new additions, the VPR discussed merging with Colina and decided to send a Jewish activist named Yara Yavelberg, who you can see on the right, to Rio de Janeiro as an emissary to the sister organization, where she stayed with a Colina activist named Gilma Rousseff. In July 1969, the 2 organizations' leaders met in Teresópolis, in the state of Rio de Janeiro, to formalize their merger, adopting a new name, Revolutionary Armed Vanguard Palmares, or VAR Palmares for short, in homage to an African Maroon community in northeastern Brazil that resisted Portuguese colonial rule for much of the 17th century. Like the Uruguayan Tupamaros, who named themselves after the 18th century indigenous leader Tupac Amaru, the new organization sought to assert its historical legitimacy by adopting the name of a site of colonial resistance. In one of its first actions, Val Palmares robbed a safe belonging to the mistress of a corrupt former governor of São Paulo, Admar de Barros, netting the organization over $2.5 million US. As students' commitments to armed struggle intensified, they often had to choose between the educational careers and their revolutionary vocations, leaving the very institutions that had prompted their politicization. And this I discussed further in the first section, which I've skipped. Anna Burstein interrupted her university studies, moved out of her parents' house, and went to work as a telephone operator. She began dating a former classmate who was in the ALN, and this new relationship led her to join her romantic partner's organization, taking part in 2 car heists and a bank robbery. Meanwhile, in an attempt to expand their cause beyond the southern zone of Rio de Janeiro, COSEC activists transferred to working-class schools in the northern zone or left school altogether and took blue-collar jobs. Alfredo Sirkis and Luis Carlos Rotberg moved to schools in Rio's northern zone, while Ari Reutemann left Colégio Pedro II, moved to the favela of Caju, and went to work in a factory. While the decision to forsake their bourgeois southern zone privileges may have enhanced these students' feelings of revolutionary belonging, their visible racial difference from their new neighbors underscored the limits of this belonging. I was like an extraterrestrial in the favela, recalled Reutemann. Due to his foreign appearance, his new neighbors called him the German. Other Jewish student activists opted to remain in school, but took advantage of their innocuous identities to perform revolutionary tasks on behalf of underground activists. Maurice Politi became a member of Marighell's organization in 1967, while studying in a preparatory course for the college entrance exam secretly run by activists from that organization. In 1968, he enrolled in the University of São Paulo Communications Department while continuing his activism in what had become the ALN. His above-ground status enabled him to work in the organization's logistical sector, renting apartments and buying cars under false names. Eva Skazufka continued her medical studies at the University of São Paulo, but performed a number of services on behalf of Valpalmares, such as exchanging dollars from the purloined Bahu safe for Brazilian cruzeiros, and setting up a clandestine medical clinic. While the Bahu safe guaranteed Valpalmares financial stability and enabled it to abstain from risky bank hastes, this newfound stability prompted fierce ideological discussions that ended up sundering the organization's unity. At a congress in Teresópolis in September 1969 intended to ratify the merger between Colina and VPR, the majority of the delegates rejected the theses of the organization's leading theoretician, Ladislav Dober, codenamed Jamil, that Valpalmares should renounce political organizing under workers, students, and peasants in favor of an exclusive focus on guerrilla warfare. This rejection prompted those in favor of the Jamil theses, including Carlos Lamarca, to break from Valpalmares and reconstitute the VPR. The break was along ideological rather than organizational lines. Some former Colina activists joined the new VPR, while many former VPR activists remained in Valpalmares. This schism also divided families. Yara Yavelberg, who had become Lamarca's romantic partner while sharing a safe house with him in São Paulo, joined the new VPR, while her brothers Samuel and Raul opted to remain in Valpalmares. Following the schism, members of both Valpalmares and the VPR attempted to recruit Koseki activists to their respective organizations, forcing these activists to make difficult decisions about organizational and revolutionary belonging. Alfredo Sirkis disagreed with the Jamil theses, but his high school friend Carlos Baumfeld had sided with the VPR, claiming that only the VPR had the capacity to undertake guerrilla war against the dictatorship. Sirkis ended up choosing the VPR, but he acknowledged in his memoir that this decision had more to do with his friendship with Baumfeld and admiration for Lamarca than any ideological criteria. Alberto Sprecher, also part of the COSEC, faced a different decision. He was drawn to the VPR as well, but his girlfriend Teresa Cristina Peixoto preferred Valpalmares. Had they joined separate organizations, they would have had to break up, since for security reasons, clandestine activists couldn't remain in regular contact with activists from other organizations. Instead, they opted to desbundar, to drop out of the armed struggle and focus on their studies. They also began to explore the burgeoning Rio de Janeiro counterculture, which Sprecher remembered as, quote, travel, marijuana circulating, counterculture, Woodstock, the hippie movement. Life was still an adventure, but without the risk of torture. Other COSEC activists decided to drop out of the armed struggle after the arrests of close friends underscored the dangers of revolutionary belonging. In October 1969, police arrested Carlos Baumfeld in his Northern Zone safe house after a neighbor had denounced him upon discovering that he really lived in the Southern Zone neighborhood of Flamengo. As Ari Reutemann found upon his own move to the Northern Zone, Baumfeld's visible difference and lack of geographic belonging proved to be his undoing. His arrest prompted his friend Luis Carlos Friedman also to leave the armed struggle. This decision was a difficult one and caused him a great deal of inner turmoil because his revolutionary belonging had become an essential component of his identity. I felt a strong anguish when I stopped being an activist, Friedman recalled. I thought, what is the point of life without making revolution? His classmates Luis Carlos Rothberg and Jaime Ben Shimol left the armed struggle around the same time. Not all Jewish COSEC members, however, were able to disconnect so easily. Rosanna Glatt found herself unable to leave student politics since her political activism and social belonging were so closely intertwined. I disconnected myself several times, she said, but kept returning because I felt empty, adrift. Alfredo Sirkis also resolved to continue. Thinking in generational terms, he vowed to be true to, quote, the historic role of our generation, to be the armed vanguard of the revolution at its most difficult phase, end quote. It would not be easy. The Brazilian military dictatorship responded to the growing threat posed by the armed struggle by creating extra-legal intelligence agencies to crack down on urban guerrillas. In July 1969, the São Paulo-based Second Army established Operation Bandeirante, known as OBAN, which received funding from Brazilian and foreign companies such as Ultragas, General Motors, and the Ford Motor Company. Oban and its rival intelligence agency, DOPS, both relied on the extensive use of torture to obtain the locations of safe houses and street meetings between armed struggle activists. On November 4th, 1969, using information obtained under torture, DOPS agents assassinated the ALN leader, Carlos Marighella, on Casablanca Avenue in the upscale São Paulo neighborhood of Jardins. 3 weeks later, on November 21st, DOPS agents in Rio arrested 3 Val Palmares activists, including a Jewish militant named Shael Charles Schreier, in their safe house in the Northern Zone neighborhood of Meir. Brought to DOPS headquarters in downtown Rio, and then to Army Police headquarters on Barão G. Mesquita Street, DOPS and Army agents subjected the 3 activists to brutal torture, which led to Schreier's death at the age of 23 from internal bleeding. In addition to arresting and torturing armed struggle activists, the military regime placed the homes of their friends and relatives under surveillance. Police in Rio de Janeiro surveilled Anna Burstein's family home in Copacabana, tapping their telephone line. On December 30th, 1969, the day of her 21st birthday, DOPS agents besieged the Burstein home on the expectation that Anna would come visit. When she failed to appear by the evening, agents invaded the house, arresting her mother and 14-year-old sister Perla, and bringing them to Army Police headquarters. After her 25-year-old brother Jaime came home from work, police arrested him as well, keeping the 3 in detention until the following morning. No longer able to remain in Rio, Burstein moved to São Paulo, where she lived in a series of rooms in boarding houses under false identities. Following the assassination of Carlos Marighella, his close ally and former Communist Party comrade, Joaquim Camara Ferreira, assumed the leadership of the ALN. Needing an above-ground activist without a police record to serve as his aide, the organization turned to Maurice Politi, who rented Ferreira an apartment in the Southern Zone neighborhood of Americanopolis in January 1970, and brought him food supplies 3 times a week. This arrangement lasted until March, when Oban agents arrested Politi and another ALN activist during a street meeting with a 3rd activist from Rio de Janeiro. Politi's arrest had serious implications for his national belonging. Having immigrated to Brazil from Egypt as a minor, he could only apply for citizenship after turning 21, a process that he began shortly after being arrested, before being arrested. After a month at Oban headquarters, he was transferred to DOPS custody, and it was here that his interrogators discovered that he was not a Brazilian citizen. As a foreigner who had violated the national security law, Politi was subject to expulsion after he completed his 4-year prison term, but his case was complicated by his statelessness, since he had lost his Egyptian citizenship. Unable to remain in Brazil or return to Egypt, Politi moved to Israel in 1975. Agents of state violence also impugned the national belonging of Brazilian Jewish citizens. The first time that these activists were made to feel that their Jewishness was a marker of difference between them and other anti-dictatorship activists. In April 1970, Oban agents arrested Eva Skazufka and her husband, Rubens Bergel. At Oban headquarters, the interrogators attempted to use Skazufka's Jewishness to challenge her national belonging. They spoke very badly of Jews, she recalled. They said that Jews controlled all the money in the world, that everything was the fault of the Jews, that Jews were all communists. Like Brazilian fascists in the 1930s, her captors ascribed to the anti-Semitic idea of Judeo-Bolshevism, which claimed that Jewish capitalists and communists were working in tandem in a quest for Jewish domination. Meanwhile, Skazufka attempted to turn her captors' exaggerated fears of Jewish power to her advantage. 2 months pregnant at the time of her arrest, she threatened that Israel would avenge her if something happened to her pregnancy. Next slide, please, Anandaru. Thank you. As the arrests of activists continued, armed struggle organizations began to kidnap foreign diplomats as a means of obtaining the release of political prisoners. The first organization to employ this tactic was the Student Dissidents of Guevara, which renamed itself the October 8th Movement, MR8, after the date of Che Guevara's last battle in Bolivia. In September 1969, the MR8 kidnapped the US ambassador to Brazil, Charles Burke Elbrick, releasing him in exchange for 15 political prisoners who were exiled to Mexico. In March 1970, the VPR adopted the tactic, kidnapping the Japanese consul in São Paulo and exchanging him for 5 imprisoned activists. On June 11th, the VPR struck again, kidnapping the West German ambassador, Ehrenfried von Holbein. Alfredo Serkis, who had joined a VPR commando unit in January 1970, participated in the operation as the English interpreter. The operation culminated in the release of 40 political prisoners, including Serkis' former classmate, Carlos Baumfeld, who you can see here roughly in the center of the image with holding the V sign to his chin. In June 1970, when her roommate went to Rio to participate in the Holbein kidnapping, Anna Burstein went to stay with an old summer camp friend, Marina Sendach, in her family's apartment in Bom Retiro, a central São Paulo neighborhood with a large Jewish population. After 1 month with the Sendach family, she moved into an ALN safe house elsewhere, but remained in contact with Marina via daily street meeting so that Sendach could keep her informed of the Burstein family's efforts to obtain the necessary documentation for her to leave the country to seek medical treatment for a chronic kidney ailment in Cuba. Unfortunately, on the day that Marina was to give her the news that her family had obtained the required documents, Anna was late for the meeting and Sendach left before she arrived. To kill time before an afternoon meeting, Burstein went into the nearby Mappin department store, where she was accused of shoplifting and brought to the store's 7th floor security department. When guards tried to search her handbag, she shot one of them, resulting in her arrest and subsequent transfer to Oban headquarters. There, in keeping with the agency's mandate to discipline and punish, she was severely tortured, including beatings, electric shocks, the dragon's chair, which was a metal chair that augmented the effects of the shocks, and the parrot's perch, which was a bar from which she was suspended by her wrists and ankles. They wanted to destroy you psychologically, Burstein remembered, so that you gave away more information, so that you never again resisted or returned to the struggle. With its ranks depleted as a result of arrests and defections to other organizations, the VPR tried to undertake another kidnapping in December 1970 of the Swiss ambassador Giovanni Bucher. The kidnapping was successful, and VPR activists spirited Bucher to a safe house on Tacaratu Street in the Northern Zone neighborhood of Honorio Gurgel. Alfredo Serkis, once again assuming the role of interpreter, was one of the 5 activists who stayed in the safe house. The VPR demanded the release of 70 political activists, but the dictatorship, evidently playing for time while it searched for the safe house, initially just denied receiving the demands, and then agreed to release only 51 of the 70 activists. This prompted a fierce debate within the VPR over whether to send a new list of names or to execute Bucher if the regime didn't honor the first list. Eager to display their revolutionary firmness, 15 members of the organization supported the latter position, while only 3 favored further negotiations. Within the safe house, the vote was 3-2 in favor of executing the ambassador, with Serkis and Carlos Lamarca opposed, but as leader of the operation, Lamarca decided to veto the execution. The VPR sent a new list of names, and eventually both sides agreed on 70 activists to be freed. The entire operation lasted 40 days. Although it had freed a record number of activists, the drawn-out nature of the operation convinced the VPR that kidnapping ambassadors was no longer a viable tactic, and with its numbers drastically reduced, rural guerrilla warfare was not a realistic possibility. Moreover, the fact that the majority of the organization had favored executing Bucher led Serkis to question his organizational belonging, and he decided to leave the VPR and go into exile. The VPR cannot be transformed, he argued to his fellow activist Alex Polari. The deformations are too ingrained. For Serkis, the organization's disavowal of mass organizing in favor of an exclusive focus on guerrilla war had left it socially isolated, an organization of 30 guys at war with the regime, as Serkis recalled. As Donatella Della Porta has argued in her study of guerrilla movements in Italy and Germany, social isolation often prompted underground organizations to adopt extreme positions, emphasizing organizational solidarity over political effectiveness. For similar reasons, Carlos Lamarca also decided to leave the VPR, although he insisted on staying in Brazil. Yari Avelberg likewise considered exile. Sometimes I want to go abroad, especially since my 2 brothers are in Chile, she confided to Serkis during a meeting. Aware of the risks of remaining in Brazil, her commitment to Lamarca took precedence over her security concerns. In March 1971, Serkis and Polari helped Lamarca and Yavelberg move over to MR8, and 2 months later, Serkis left for Chile. MR8 had an extensive support network, which drew heavily on activists with roots in the Rio High School student movement. In early 1971, after a year away from politics, Alberto Sprecher and his girlfriend Teresa Cristina Peixoto joined the MR8 support network, which enabled them to participate in the armed struggle without leaving their homes or becoming clandestine. In one of his first actions, Alberto took a road trip to Chile with Ari Reutemann, the network's coordinator, to bring political documents to activists released in the Bucher kidnapping. In another action, in April 1971, Sprecher and Peixoto conducted a stakeout of a supermarket in the neighborhood of Botafogo, observing what time the money was collected and reporting this information to Reutemann. After 3 months of hiding, in MR8 safe houses in Rio, in June 1971, Yara Yalvaberg and Carlos Lamarca traveled to Bahia. In the Bahian crossroads town of Jequié, they split up, with Lamarca continuing on to Brotas de Macaúbas, a rural community where he intended to engage in political organizing work, while Yara, whose recurring health issues required medical treatment, made her way to Salvador. On August 19th, police invaded the safe house where she was staying along with 3 other MR8 activists, arresting the other 3. Yalvaberg managed to hide in the bathroom of a neighboring apartment, and police had already left the building when a young boy discovered her there. He told his mother, who told a relative that informed the police, and they promptly returned to arrest her. What happened next is disputed. The police claimed that Yalvaberg shot herself in the chest, but the family maintained that she had been shot, and an autopsy conducted years later concluded that she had been shot at long range. The shot proved to be fatal, and Yalvaberg died at the age of 27. The same day that police raided her safe house, Cesar Benjamin traveled to Rio, where he met with the MR8 leader, João Lopes Salgado, who gave him letters that Lamarca had written to Yara in the form of a diary to give to Yalvaberg on his return to Salvador. Ari Reutemann was out of town at his mother's apartment in Nova Friburgo, so he asked Sprecher to pick up Benjamin from Luis Carlos Rotberg's apartment, where he had spent the previous 2 nights. When their car was stopped at a police roadblock on Vieira Soto Avenue in Ipanema, Benjamin managed to escape along the nearby Jardim Giala Canal, and he phoned Reutemann's apartment to inform Ari's mother of Sprecher's arrest. Reutemann's parents hid Ari at a family friend's vacation home for 2 months before smuggling him to Argentina. He was tried in absentia along with Sprecher, Peixoto Rotberg, Jaime Ben Shimol, and 2 other Jewish members of the MR8 support network in a police military inquest that military officials called the Jews trial. This inquest revealed how social ties forged in Jewish elementary schools and summer camps continued to play important roles for Jewish activists in the armed struggle against the military dictatorship. But the arrest of Benjamin's car mates had even more serious consequences for the armed struggle. The diary that Benjamin had left behind enabled Brazilian police and army officials to locate Lamarca in his hideout in the Bahian backlands, and they executed him 1 month later, on September 17, 1971. Although the urban armed struggle would continue into 1973, the death of Lamarca symbolized the beginning of its end. Reporting on the deaths of Yalvaberg and Lamarca for the Brazilian newspaper Mariv, a Brazilian Jewish journalist named David Marcus eulogized them as adherents of the Torah of Che Guevara. It was a description that could have fit many of their comrades in exile, prisons, or living clandestinely in Brazil. While previous studies of the Brazilian armed struggle have emphasized its political dimensions, turning towards effective history enables a fuller understanding of the motivations and inner conflicts of the anti-dictatorship opposition. This article has offered an effective history of Brazilian Jewish student armed struggle activists. Coming of age during the turbulent 1960s, these activists became politicized through the influences of classmates, teachers, and romantic partners who they met at leftist Jewish elementary schools and summer camps, elite public high schools, and university departments. Their political initiations reflected desires for generational belonging in social groups, academic institutions, clandestine organizations, and the revolutionary politics of the long 1960s. Initially drawn to leftist political parties such as the Brazilian Communist Party, these activists subsequently made their way to splinter groups, advocating armed struggle as the only viable way of overthrowing the Brazilian military dictatorship, joining their friends and romantic partners in guerrilla organizations then proliferating throughout southern Brazilian cities. As their political engagement deepened, Jewish activists needed to make difficult choices regarding what their generational belonging entailed. For some activists, this meant renouncing their middle-class origins and educational institutions, leaving behind the very schools where they had begun their political trajectories in an attempt to spread the revolutionary message among students and workers in less privileged settings. While the decision to forsake their middle-class environments enhanced Jewish activists' feelings of revolutionary belonging, their visible racial difference from their new neighbors revealed that belonging's limits. Meanwhile, the sundering of revolutionary organizations forced activists to choose between rival forms of organizational belonging, even as the arrests of close friends underscored the perilous consequences of revolutionary belonging. These arrests prompted some Jewish activists to leave the armed struggle altogether. Although with their political and social lives closely intertwined, abandoning revolutionary politics often fostered feelings of anguish and alienation. Heightened state repression further underscored the importance of Jewish social ties in the armed struggle, as clandestine Jewish and non-Jewish activists alike joined networks formed in Jewish schools and summer camps to evade arrest and obtain housing and transportation. The salience of these networks paradoxically affirmed the highly integrated nature of Jewish militants within the armed struggle, as these networks served the broader goals of the armed struggle rather than particular Jewish interests. It was only following their arrests that Jewish activists needed to confront their Jewish difference. When torturers used their alleged foreignness to impugn their national belonging, other Jewish activists went into exile to avoid arrest or chose to leave Brazil after ideological differences prompted them to reconsider their organizational belonging. As the Brazilian 60s came to an end, Brazilian Jewish activists left behind the Torah of Che Guevara to resume their educations and careers, refashion their lives in exile, and seek new forms of belonging in Brazil, Latin America, and beyond. Thank you.
On mute.
Thank you, Michael. Thank you for that. It was really fascinating. Before I just open it up for discussion, how does the question format work here? I'm just curious. Is there a show hands kind of a thing like in Zoom? Yeah, question. So there is a set of questions. I'm not sure how this works, but I'm but let me just okay. So yeah, there is a Q&A block on the right. Okay, we have a question already. This is a question from Bodhi Shattu. Sorry, Bodhi, are you there with us? There are 3 questions. Yeah. The first question, I'll just read out the question to you, Michael. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah. So the first question, this is okay, this is anonymous. I don't know who's asked this question, but this research is fascinating. I'm just reading out. Could you maybe tell us a bit more about how you got into this? Do you want me to read the 3 questions that I have together, and maybe you can respond, or do you want to respond individually?
You can read them all out.
Okay. So that's the first one. The second one is, what proportion were the Jewish students activists of all Jewish students? How did the establishment Jewish community respond to the student activists? These are the 2 questions I think we have right now. If you would like to respond, Michael.
Okay, sure. Thank you for the questions. Regarding the first question, I became interested in Jewish students in the armed struggle in large part due to discovering Alfredo Sarkis's memoir, which is in Portuguese known as Os Carbonarios, in which he gives a very evocative account of his participation in the armed struggle. And I noticed that many of the names that he mentioned of his closest friends and comrades were obviously Jewish names, such as Baumfeld, Rotberg, Reitman. So I was interested to learn more, and searching through the Brazil Nunca Mais database, which is a database of secret police records that's available online. Searching some of these names, such as Alberto Sprecher, I discovered the trial of the Jews, where 6 out of 7 defendants and all 4 witnesses were Jewish. So I thought there was an interesting Jewish angle. They weren't acting on behalf of specific Jewish interests, but they were congregating with other Jewish activists. So I felt that was something I wanted to explore further. And I was able, fortunately, to interview many of these people in Rio and Sao Paulo, including Sarkis, who recently, unfortunately, passed away in a car accident in this past July. So I was able to meet many of these people, and much of these quotes that I was sharing were from oral history interviews. So that's essentially how I got into it. I got interested in the dictatorship, in part due to my Portuguese language classes, where the professors emphasized that theme. We watched many movies about the dictatorship, and I was also interested to, as someone born in South Africa, and always very interested in the role of Jewish activists in the struggle against apartheid. I was interested to see if this was a parallel situation, and I found that in some ways it was, but in many ways it wasn't, as I think that many of the Jews involved in fighting against apartheid were involved through the Communist Party, and were actually a generation older than many of these activists that I profile in my presentation today. So that's something I could discuss further if anyone is interested, but I'll leave it at that for now. As regarding the proportion of Jewish students, obviously a very minuscule proportion. I think there were something like 75 Jewish students among all armed struggle activists. But as I've tried to show here, even for those who weren't directly involved in the armed struggle, there were levels of involvement. Others were involved in support networks, providing transportation or logistical support, while a third level were involved as sympathizers who would occasionally help friends in need, whether for reasons of politics or friendship. It's sometimes hard to decide. And so this participation really rippled outward into society as a whole. The mainstream Jewish community obviously was very much not interested in these activists who they dismissed as communists in any case, and had very little to do with them.
Sorry, my charge ran out on this.
Okay. Great. I guess if anyone has any further questions or follow-up questions, you can type.
There are questions. Can you see the questions on the right side?
Yeah, sorry, I can see here.
Yeah. So Veronica, yeah.
So background about the political history of Jews and Brazil and its Jews. Definitely. Most Brazilian Jews immigrated to Brazil between World War I and World War II in the 1920s and 1930s. During these 2 decades, Brazil was actually the 4th most popular destination for Jewish immigration after the United States, Palestine, and Argentina. And Brazil was governed between 1937 and 1945 by the Getúlio Vargas dictatorship. Between 1946 and 1964 it was a post-war democratic regime. And between 64 and 85, military dictatorship. And then 85 onward, once again, a democracy. So in my own research, I deal with predominantly the whole period of the Cold War, but predominantly the post-war democracy and the military dictatorship. I have 2 chapters on each period, one dealing with the issue of Jewish immigration and the presence of Nazi war criminals in Brazil, a second chapter looking on the internal struggles within the Jewish community between Zionists and communists. Then there's this chapter that I've presented now, part of it, on Jewish armed struggle activists. And I have another chapter on these fight between Brazilian Zionists and the Palestine Liberation Organization, who tried to open an office in Brazil in the late 1970s. And that's another chapter that I deal with, in addition to overviews of the post-war democracy and an early chapter on the Vargas dictatorship. So Brazil has a very turbulent history, but what's interesting about it are that it has these very long, discrete periods of democratic and dictatorial rule, unlike places like Argentina, which very much alternated every few years or so. So that makes these 2 periods very useful for comparing the impact of democratic and dictatorial rule on Jewish politics, and that's what I look at. Regarding the next question, Rothman and Lichter, studying the American Jewish left in 1982, found that ethnicity, social class, and attitudes to parents were crucial in determining the emergence of authoritarian attitudes in the US New Left. I was interested in that question, and I was struck by some of the parallels with South Africa, so it'd be great to hear more about your thoughts on that point. Yes, please say something more about the comparison with SA Jewish activists, especially those of the same generation you have dealt with in Brazil. Okay, so I'll deal with the issue of the comparison, which is actually something I would like to compare more overtly going forward in future research. But one thing I've noticed is that the majority of South African Jewish activists were from an earlier generation, born in the 20s and 30s as opposed to the 40s and 50s, and became activists through the Communist Party. And then following the Rivonia trial, most of these people are already in exile or in prison. So it's an earlier generation, whereas in Brazil, these Jewish activists, some of whom came from leftist or communist Jewish families, really became involved through the student movement in 1964 to 1968, and as part of dissidents who broke with the Communist Party, specifically due to its failure to embrace armed struggle, the model coming from Cuba. So a very different political genealogy. I would say there's some of the similarities between the two communities, obviously aside from the fact that both are operating in multiracial societies that have some degree of, racial and socioeconomic stratification, whether overt in the South African case or covert in the Brazilian case. Both generations are really benefiting. They're the second generation of immigration, and they're benefiting from their parents' socioeconomic upward mobility, and to some extent the influence of the Communist Party itself on post-war politics, particularly the prestige that the Communist Party derived from the Soviet Union's role in the defeat of Nazism, which very much inspired the previous generation of Brazilian Jewish activists to become communists. Does there exist material and attitudes towards parents among Jewish activists in Brazil? Yeah, that's an interesting question. Serkis actually deals with that in his memoir through the figure of Luis Carlos Rothberg, whose father, Mario Rothberg, was a communist activist. Actually, many of the people I've spoke about, you might have noticed that the name Luis Carlos recurs. Luis Carlos Rothberg, Luis Carlos Friedman, Carlos Mink, and these were actually named after Luis Carlos Prestes, who's the long-term Secretary General of the Brazilian Communist Party. So there is this generation of communists that then send their children to a leftist Jewish school named Eliezer Steinberg, and that's where many of them meet, and then as well the leftist Jewish camp Kinderland, which I talk about in a section of this chapter that I haven't shared. And that's Kinderland is really where they forge their bond. They then go to different high schools, but they maintain connected through their social group. But many of their parents had actually broken with the Communist Party in 1956. And so Rothberg is actually paranoid that his father is going to denounce him as a way of proving that he is broken with his communist past. So that's the extent that generational differences appear. And in other cases, such as Anna Burstein, her parents, particularly her father, were fellow travelers, essentially, communist fellow travelers. So there was less of an overt break. And her parents were opposed to the coup. Serkis's parents, who were Polish Jewish Holocaust survivors, at least his father very much supported the coup, was a fervent anti-communist. And Serkis grew up, when he was 13, he also supported the coup, but later when he goes to the Colégio de Aplicação, which was a school associated with the Federal University of Rio, was very progressive politically. Then he meets a lot of these Jewish activists like Carlos McBaumfeld, Luis Carlos Rothberg, and breaks with his liberal father. So that leads to a lot of arguments about the Vietnam War, among other things. So what I'm trying to say, in which I show more in the section that I didn't have time for today, is that there were multiple paths of politicization. Some students came out of leftist Jewish homes and were in some ways continuing their parents' activism, although in a very different direction. And in other cases, they came from mainstream liberal bourgeois homes that supported the coup. So there was more of a rupture, both with their parents, but also with their Judaism. And so people that tended to come from a more right-wing background saw themselves as breaking with Judaism, with, understood as synagogue attendance or observance of Jewish ritual, whereas those who came from leftist or communist Jewish homes saw themselves, even today, see themselves as very much continuing their parents' ideals and less overtly rupturing. So I wouldn't say that generational difference was so important in politicizing these students. I would say what was more important was being part of a generational experience of really challenging the military regime, challenging prevailing sexual mores, the idea that, again, in a section that I didn't have time for, Burstein talks about these discussions at university, Anna Burstein, in 1968 that revolved around whether you could have sex before marriage, at the same time as discussing how to oppose the dictatorship. So these discussions, these political and social contestations very much went hand in hand. And this was very much a generational experience, if not directly focused on their own parents' ideals. Most Jewish families were liberal, you know, in their social mores, but at least focused on being part of this generational experience of Brazilian society. What is the Jewish population in Brazil today? What percentage of the total population? The Jewish population is about 150,000, as it was also during the period that I look at. Brazil as a whole is 200 million people, so it's a very small percentage. But what I found interesting was it's very much clustered. I would say, you know, it's important to remember that the middle class society, of which most Brazilian Jews were part by the 60s, was itself only 10% of Brazilian society. So if we're thinking about population of about 90 million, national population in 1970, we can imagine the middle class itself was only 9 or 10 million. So the Jewish percentage then is greater. And in a place like the Colégio de Aplicação, which was a public school that students had to pass an entrance exam to get into, and was very progressive politically and led to many Jewish and non-Jewish activists joining the armed struggle. Jews made up a third of the student body at this time in 1967, for when I have, which is the year for which I have data available. So Jews were small as a whole in Brazilian society, but very much prominent in specific sectors that were then those sectors that sent many people, from which many people in the armed struggle emerged. So I think this middle class experience is very much a key to understanding the Jewish involvement in the armed struggle. The armed struggle was itself seen as very much the preserve of middle class students at a time when only 5 to 10% of Brazilians of university age were attending post-secondary education. Okay, next question. You may not have the data, but assuming you do, can you explain why the SA Jewish boomer generation activists were far less involved in the armed struggle than those in Brazil? So that's really a test for my knowledge of South African historiography. It seems that, you know, this is still an area that I'm not as familiar with as I'd like to be, but it does seem that, you know, there's a lull between 63 and 76, which is exactly the period in South America when many activists were becoming prominent, and in South Africa it seems like that was really a low point for the ANC and other anti-apartheid organizations. So I think that's maybe one experience. Perhaps the influence of the Cuban Revolution was less strong among South African students than it was in Brazil and Argentina. I mean, here I'm speculating since I haven't directly compared, but what I am interested in researching is actually this generation, the boomer generation, as you say, of Jewish students in South Africa who I feel have not received a lot of scholarly attention. So it very well may be that there were many Jewish students who were involved to the extent that their circumstances permitted between the Rivonia trial and in 1976, the Soweto uprising. But I think it just hasn't been sufficiently researched, whereas most attention tends to be devoted to people like Dennis Goldberg, Lionel Burdenstein, Joe Slovo, Ruth First, this generation, which is an older generation. I think there was a very important component. I imagine there was a very important component of Jewish activists of the later generation who were not as prominent in the ANC, and but it just have yet to be researched. More, what I'm interested in researching are more and more the everyday revolutionaries, as they've been called in the Latin American context, people who aren't at the forefront, but are very much involved behind the scenes. And I think that's where we'll find more interesting participation of Jewish students. So that's more or less where my thoughts are at the moment. Interesting.
Sorry. No, there are a couple of more comments.
Yeah. So the Foucault theory was adopted by SACP and then ANC. Yeah, that's another reason why there maybe wasn't as much of a need for a rupture with the SACP and the ANC, in that the SACP was more militant than the PCB, the Brazilian Communist Party, and more willing to be influenced by these prevailing political currents, which the Brazilian Communist Party saw as political adventurism. And I guess the other important context is the role of Cuba in Angola, and obviously the ANC's role in Angola, and so there's a more of a willingness to ally with Cuba, whereas in the Brazilian Communist Party expels Carlos Marighella after he attends an armed struggle activist conference in Havana in 1967. So there's less willingness to approach. There's more of a willingness to toe the Moscow line, which was against the armed struggle, and then perhaps in the South African Congress. In the South African context, there was more flexibility. So leader of the UCT sit-in 1968, Rafik Kaplinski was Jewish. His family were communists, and he came up through a radical Jewish youth group. Yeah, that's very interesting and something I'd like to explore more. There's also a Jewish member of ARM. I guess you're thinking of Adrian Leftwich. Yeah. I mean, obviously there are people here and there. What I'm interested in exploring are the role of social networks rather than merely isolated activists, but Jewish social networks that facilitate armed struggle activism. That's really, I would say, the heart of this paper that I've presented, although I wasn't able today to talk as much about the emergence of these social networks, which were themselves the product of the post-war democratic period. Both this Jewish elementary school and summer camp are created in the early 50s. So yeah, it's very much a post-war phenomenon. Okay, any further?
We are almost, I think it's 7. I had just a short question. If I don't see any other questions coming in right now, I'll just abuse my position and ask you the question. I'm just wondering, I mean, it's really, the narrative is fascinating, and it's had so many, echoes, because that's the period, right? It has echoes in South Asia, it has echoes in Southern Africa, in terms of the larger global student movement. So I was wondering, what exactly, I mean, how does the Jewishness actually play itself out in this analytic? I mean, this could be a story about any other community.
Yeah.
Is it what I'm trying to get to, and you have already answered it through certain ways in terms of the sociological networks that pointing out the social hubs around which these kind of networks emerged. I was wondering if there is anything else in terms of an analytic that Jewishness provides in your argument. And also, similarly, I have a similar kind of query regarding Cold War. I mean, you mentioned both Cold War and Jewishness in the title. I was wondering if there is any analytical purchase apart from the sociological immediacy of groups and institutions. Is there anything else going on, or is it an unconscious for these people, for the left students, young students, that apart from the fact that they meet because they're in these institutions, in their thinking, in their practice, because that's something which I was curious about. I mean, I didn't really get a sense of that, or maybe that's not a concern. I was just wondering about that.
Yeah, those are both excellent questions, and both questions that I'm still grappling with. Regarding Jewishness, I am stressing the sociological aspect, and to some extent this experience of having parents or institutions that are coming from the left, which was distinct from other ethnic communities in Brazil that didn't have these networks in place. The other aspect that I sort of touch on is once they're arrested, then they're made to feel very different. Their Jewishness becomes a problem. They're seen as Jewish communists trying to overthrow the Brazilian state in light of the international Jewish communist conspiracy. And this wasn't, I mean, there certainly was a lot of anti-Semitism among Brazilian secret police, but this is a common technique in torture to try to find your adversary's weak point and exploit it. I think another aspect maybe that I don't look at, but is I think very much there for this generation, is the question of the Holocaust, which is only 2 decades before. Only in the case of Serkis, among the people I talk about today, were they directly the children of survivors. His parents both were Polish Jews who survived the war in the Soviet Union, but this is something I think I could explore further. Regarding the Cold War, I mean, this is the focus of the project as a whole, looking at Jewish politics in light of the Cold War context. And this chapter is a bit of a departure. I mean, it's not about the Jewish community writ large, it's about a specific segment of the Jewish community. Previous chapters are much more focused on the mainstream community. But, you know, obviously the armed struggle is very much a Cold War phenomenon. Vietnam War was very much in the thoughts of these students, as was the 1967 Israeli-Arab War, which is perhaps another way that Jewishness plays in. Serkis actually mentions in his memoir, you know, regularly going to a Palestinian restaurant and feeling that he thought was connected to the PLO and feeling good about that. So that's, I guess, another way Jewishness comes in, kind of more as a in an oppositional way. So yeah, I mean, obviously the whole armed struggle experience, the whole experience of the Brazilian military regime is very much a Cold War story. I guess perhaps if you're asking about the transnational elements, I think in this chapter I'm more focused on the 1960s.
I was actually more interested. I mean, not more interested, but I was actually asking around the internationalism built in the Cold War and how that internationalism builds or perhaps intersects with a sort of, you know, almost ontological, itinerancy that is associated with the Jewish population. So does the Cold War, in that sense, that kind of internationalism of politics play some role in terms of the imagination of these young left people? So that's, I mean, I understand what you're trying to do. I was more curious, and maybe that's in work in terms of how in this paper, I thought both of these questions were as a background rather than at the center of the analysis. I would be very keen to actually read more about the institutions and the nature of the institutions and the interactions and how.
I mean, I think in terms of internationalism, I'm more focused on the Latin American 60s and the global 60s as a frame, rather than, which is obviously also an episode in the Cold War, the cultural Cold War. Right. So obviously the Cuban example is very much at the forefront. Che Guevara is very much at the forefront. Vietnam War, Maoism. They're adopting techniques from, you know, criticism, self-criticism that are Maoist. So it's a little bit of a hodgepodge. I mean, they've broken with the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union is no longer their ideological model, unlike in previous chapters where it's really a dispute between the US and the USSR as the two poles of the Brazilian Jewish community. Now it's the third pole of Cuba. So it's I think to the extent that they're international, they're very much, Cuba is really now becoming the ideological homeland. When they need to escape, they go to Cuba. You know, later they go to, in reality, they go to France and Chile, which is another place that becomes important. Chile is governed by Allende at this time, so most Brazilian military exiles go to, armed struggle exiles go to Chile, and then after the coup in Chile, then they have to go to France or Portugal. So it's a second exile. But Cuba is really where they're getting their training, and their ideological influences are very much coming from Cuba. Regis Debray's book is being published by the Casa de las Americas in Havana, and that's why it's translated so quickly into so many languages as a propaganda tool. So I would say that the transnationalism is very much focused on Cuba, not as much on the Soviet Union, and on Vietnam. I mean, Serkis gets into a lot of arguments with his parents about Vietnam. Vietnam, in addition to Cuba, is what makes these Brazilian leftists believe that they can overthrow a US-sponsored military regime, which, you know, in light of hindsight, was quite ludicrous. But these are the examples that are influencing them, and things like, you know, the May 1968 in France. You know, they're very much aware of what's going on in the world. They're very urbane, cosmopolitan, looking beyond Brazil. But they're, I would say, fighting very much. It's very much a Brazilian fight. They don't see them. Perhaps they might see themselves as transnational actors, but they're really fighting in a national context. And so in this chapter, perhaps I de-emphasize the transnational frame and emphasize more the national frame, unlike other chapters where I look at how anti-Semitism in the Soviet Union really is what's behind the conflict between Zionists and communists in the 1950s Brazilian Jewish community. So I sort of jump back and forth between the national and the transnational lenses. So yeah, I mean, very interesting, thought-provoking questions. That's an important question. I haven't fully addressed how does Judaism make these people different, because they're not really trying to assert a Jewish identity. They're trying to de-emphasize their Jewish identity. They're really trying to assert a Brazilian identity and a generational identity that doesn't have much space for Jewishness, and at the same time, also in the background, not as important in this chapter, but in other chapters comes more to the forefront, this idea of racial democracy, this idea that in Brazil there are no racial differences. Obviously it's a false idea, but it's an important one, and it really limits the potential for ethnic or racial based political identities. And so this is the context in which these students unwittingly are very much expressing these ideas that racial differences aren't important in the Brazilian context, and consequently ethnic differences aren't either, when in fact racial differences do, you know, even geographic racial differences mean that when these students go from the southern zone that's predominantly white to the northern zone of Rio that's predominantly colored, they're very visible, right? They're seen as Germans, which is the major, you know, there are more Germans in Brazil than Jews, so Germans are seen as a better known ethnicity. I guess ironically. So yeah, so these racial differences are apparent, but there's this ideology that they've unwittingly imbibed that says that racial differences are not important in the Brazilian context, and they're very much operating, I think, within this idea. And consequently, they're, you know, again, Marxist internationalism tends to downplay ethnic difference as well. So these are these two national and international ideologies that motivate them to really downplay their ethnic difference and try to move beyond it in a way that maybe is not as possible as they'd like. So I guess that's a challenge as a historian. How do you deal with ethnicity in a context where the actors that you're looking at are trying to downplay rather than highlight their ethnicity?
Great. I don't think we have any other questions right now. So, and we are also, I think we are now done. We have overshot a little bit. Yeah. But thank you, Michael.
Thank you.
It was a great conversation, and hope to hear and read more about your work soon. Yeah. And thank you, Alicia, Denzel, Clint, for organizing this and helping with the back end. I mean, I really didn't do any of it, so it's all of the work that has been done is actually by them. Thanks so much for this. Thanks so much for helping us set up and kicking off our seminar series for this semester. Okay, great.
Yeah, I'll echo those thanks to Alicia, Denzel, and Clint, and thank you again for being able to accommodate my time zone differences for the checkup. Very, very appreciated. Very much appreciated.
Thanks, Michael.
Yeah, thanks. Thank you, Nazru. And thank you everyone that listened and shared their questions and comments.
Great. Bye, everyone.
Aye.
Sorry, I just